Good day. This is CIGS Foreign Policy and National Security TV. And today we have a great guest from Stanford University, Dan Snyder. He's a good friend of mine. My father-in-law's good friend is his father. And we have a long story about our family relations. But today, we talk about it later, but I just want to talk about Japan-South Korea relations, which Dan has been specialized in sort of for a long time. And the readers of Toyo Keizai might have read already his latest article about Japan-South Korea relations after the announcement of whatever, the agreements or whatever they say. So, Dan, welcome to the program. And what's your take on the so-called latest agreement between Japan and South Korea?
First of all, it's great to be with Kuni and to be in this new form of talking about foreign policy here. We've done a lot of live seminars, but it's okay to do it virtually as well. I've been watching Japan-Korea relations for a long time, and I'm no secret that I'm an advocate of cooperation between Japan and Korea, and not just for the sake of the relations between the two countries, but also, frankly, from the perspective of U.S. foreign policy. American foreign policy has for a long time encouraged that type of cooperation and trilateral cooperation, and when Japan-Korea relations are deteriorating, as they have in the last 5 or 6 years, it makes that kind of cooperation really difficult. So from that point of view, the announcement which the South Korean foreign minister made earlier this week was, I think, at least a minor breakthrough in the sense that it really represents the desire of the current Korean government, the government of Yoon Suk-yeol, who came to power last spring with the goal of improving relations with Japan. Their desire to really commit themselves to this, even at the cost of some political resistance in South Korea. So on the positive side, I wouldn't call this an agreement. It was a unilateral statement by the South Korean foreign minister. And in some sense, the fact that it was a unilateral statement is a bit of a disappointment in that the two governments have been negotiating really since last summer to try and reach an agreement, particularly to settle this issue of the forced laborers and the court suit. I like to call them forced laborers because they were. I think this term, this sort of technical terminology of conscription is partially accurate, but not entirely, because of course...
Well, the Japanese laborers are also conscripted.
In the latter part of the war, Korean laborers, as well as others, were forcibly brought to labor. So, in any case, the issue of compensation and recognition of the forced laborers is a serious one, and one that's complicated in the relationship between Korea and Japan. And they were trying to reach an agreement on how to settle this issue between the two governments. They failed to bridge certain gaps, very importantly having to do with the participation of the Japanese companies who have been ruled by the Korean courts to be compelled to make payments to the laborers. So the Japanese companies are not directly participating. They created a fund that's mainly based on Korean company money, and very importantly, this is Korean companies who benefited from the 1965 normalization of relations and the settlement of claims. And that was an important thing for Japan, because the Japanese government, I think, rightfully insisted that there should be a recognition that in some sense, formally speaking, this issue was dealt with and settled by the 1965 agreement. So they wanted Japanese companies to participate. They didn't get that. and they're not getting a direct apology on the part of the Japanese companies. Why is that important? Because it's crucial that the victims themselves, that particularly the people who filed suit against the Japanese companies, that they accept this settlement. If they don't accept it, then it becomes an ongoing political problem. And that then poses...
What do you mean by them? Who accepted?
So there are...
You're talking about the Korean court?
No, I'm talking about the Korean laborers, the people who brought the suit to the Korean court, the workers themselves. They, in order for the Korean courts, I think, to accept this as a settlement, the litigants, that is the people who brought the suit, should accept it as a settlement as well.
Well, you sounded quite neutral by the probably a Korean standard, but for many viewers in Japan may have a different view on that. But I'm not defending anything at this moment. But don't you think that the settlement in 1965 was not complete? Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, it's a complicated legal question because the Korean government itself had a commission in about 15 years ago to try and ask that question of did the 1965 settlements agreement actually deal with the forced laborers? And to a large extent, it did. But then the Korean courts ruled that the individual people who made these suits could file suit against the companies directly and seek compensation. And this is not unprecedented because actually there was a group of Chinese laborers who filed a similar suit against Mitsubishi Materials, actually. And that was actually settled in 2015-16. Mitsubishi apologized and paid money.
Thanks to our mutual friend.
Thanks to our mutual friend. But that's an interesting precedent. And the difference is that there was no state-to-state agreement between China and Japan. In this case, there was a state-to-state agreement, but the attempt is to try and, in some sense, both recognize that the state agreement exists, but also to deal with the sort of moral as well as the legal issues.
To the best of my knowledge, Mitsubishi Materials case wasn't a legal settlement. It was a voluntary sort of a gesture, to the best of my knowledge.
No, so there was a suit filed in Chinese court, and the...
suit in Chinese court?
Yes, there was.
Wow, that sounds very interesting. I don't want to go into details of the
but
domestic
let's step
affair.
back to this announcement, because I think while it was a unilateral declaration on the part of South Korea, and in that sense, it would have been much better and preferable to have a joint agreement. It is, I would say, if it's not an agreement, it's an understanding, because clearly there are some reciprocal gestures that are involved. The removal of the export controls on the precursor chemicals for semiconductor production from the so-called white list.
Well, that's a different, separate issue, wasn't it?
A separate issue, except of course, and the Japanese government has insisted all along was a separate issue, except that the announcement of the lifting of these controls was made on the same day as the South Korean declaration.
We changed our mind.
Yeah. Unless that's a really great coincidence, I'd say it's pretty clear they were linked. And then we have the visit coming up of the South Korean president to Japan, and hopefully a reciprocal visit by Prime Minister Kishida to Korea, and the invitation to South Korean president to be an observer at the G7 summit meeting in Hiroshima. All those things are sort of part of the atmospherics of trying to improve relations. They don't directly address the forced laborers question. There's a separate fund that's being created that Kedanren and their South Korean Federation of Industries counterpart are going to create for funding, I think, scholarships for Korean and Japanese students. So all of these are part of the atmospherics of improving relations. But I don't think that I worry that without the kind of clear involvement of Japanese firms in this settlement, it will be politically difficult to get support for this in Korea. And President Yoon has gone, I'd say, pretty far out on a limb politically in Korea.
Was he brave?
I think he was. I think it was an act of, you could say it's an act of political courage. It's also probably, in some sense, for him, an act of political necessity, because I think he sees he's trying to drive, I think, South Korea in a certain direction, greater involvement in regional security issues in the Indo-Pacific. And I do think it's very important to him. He's taken a tougher line towards North Korea. He's tightened security relations with the United States. They're holding joint military exercises for the first time in many years. And he's going to go to Washington on an official state visit in April. And I don't think it's a stretch to say that, in some sense, moving ahead on the Korea-Japan front was part of that package. I think the problem, again, is I think they would have preferred, and I know that the foreign ministries were really seeking, in the negotiations that they've been carrying out for many months, including at the level of the two foreign ministers, to make a bilateral agreement. And that would have had, I think, greater weight and power.
Dan, you also wrote for Toyo Keizai that hinting that Prime Minister Kishida has been somehow indecisive. Is that the word you used?
Well, when the negotiation, and timid, I'd say politically timid.
Timid?
Yeah, in the sense that the negotiations that were going on between the two foreign ministers, the last round of them was held at the sidelines of the Munich Security Conference a couple of weeks ago. And the South Korean Foreign Minister, Park Jin, came out of that meeting saying basically, we've reached the end of what we can do at the level of officials. We need, this is now a political decision. And he wasn't talking about President Yoon, because I think President Yoon had made the political decision to move ahead, even though there's a lot of opposition to this in South Korea. I think Prime Minister Kishida was very cautious. And to me, there are two tests of this. One is, I don't think it's hard to get the Japanese companies that we're talking about, Nippon Steel and Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, who are the companies that have been sued in the Korean courts, to agree to give money to this Korean fund. Japanese companies want to do business in Korea. I think their main the reason they haven't moved ahead is because the Japanese government has basically said, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this, it'll undermine the legitimacy of the 1965 treaty.
Principles.
Right. Well, so that's why the South Korean government, I think, understood that, made an effort to, in fact, accept the legitimacy of the 65 agreement and create something that could, in some sense, on that basis, move ahead. I think Kishida has been hesitant. There are many reasons. Some of them are quite understandable. One is what people call Korea fatigue. Always the worry at this point that you make an agreement with the Korean government, a bilateral agreement.
And they move the goalpost again.
And
again.
Politics change, agreements fall apart. And we had the unfortunate experience of what happened with the Comfort Women Agreement of 2015, which Prime Minister Kishida was very personally involved in negotiating as foreign minister.
Right.
And then the next government came in and basically dismantled that. So there's that experience and a sense of bitterness and caution that comes from that, and that's understandable. So, then I think there's the other element, which is that there's a large segment of the ruling party, of the Liberal Democratic Party, that says no to any new apology, no to anything that, any payment of compensation. And they've been very vocal already, even the last few days, opposing any move along these lines, and you can read it in the pages of the Sankei Shimbun and places like that. So I think he has a problem of his own lack of political strength within the LDP, and I think there was a sort of, I think the caution in some sense is driven as much by internal domestic politics as it is by the experience of the past. Now, both governments have domestic politics. That's nature of democracy.
South Korea-Japan relations are domestic politics, 80%, 90%. But having said that, well, I have a slightly different view, but I'm not challenging you today. I rather want to ask you what kind of role Washington has played in this. In my view, it's a real piece of art. And because the two sort of circus people just trying to walk a tight rope finally cross somewhere. This is only one point. This is the piece of art we have witnessed.
Well, diplomacy is always a piece of art, and my criticism is only that I wanted them to go that last few steps. I think it would.
They may fall,
but what worries, I think, both myself and other people I know who are watching this closely is that if you don't create that, do that, then you're going to undermine the viability of this agreement in the long term. As to your question, though, it's an important one.
Right.
So I think the Americans have been closely watching this process. As I understand it, they basically had a hands-off towards the actual negotiating process, and I think both governments and both foreign ministries basically said to them, don't call us, we'll call you.
Stay away.
Let us try and manage this ourselves. And I think that's the right way to do things. You don't want to have the United States be the mediator. And frankly, the United States doesn't want to be the mediator. And American diplomats are very wary of getting involved, particularly in these wartime history issues, because they're so contentious. And if they get involved, then the United States becomes the bad guy, whatever the outcome is. If people who don't like it are going to point to the American role. That said, I think
the Americans could have played that role as a bad guy, but they didn't.
Well, I think there's several things going on. One is the Americans have this mantra that they repeat over and over again, which is let's focus on what's in front of us, not what's behind us. So let's focus on shared security threats, particularly North Korea, but also China, and even in some sense Russia because of the war in Ukraine. Let's focus on areas where we can cooperate, and that ranges not only from security issues but also to economic issues, because one of the things the United States is looking to do is bring both Japan and Korea into this sort of structure of controls over the flow of technology to China. And that's a very difficult issue for both Japan and South Korea, because they both have large high-tech industries with engagement in the Chinese marketplace. So let's focus on those things, not on the past. It's a great thing.
That's the position of the Japanese government as well.
And my attitude, having spent a long time working on wartime history issues, is it doesn't really work in the long term, because these issues are deeply held issues of identity, particularly in Korea. So if you try and avoid them or go around them, they'll come back and bite you in the rear. That's always what happens. So you can't escape them, so it's better to try and deal with them. And I think that's what the South Korean government is doing in trying to come up with a unilateral solution to this problem. That's one part of it. The other part of the U.S. concern, and I'm sort of reading between the lines, but not entirely, based on my conversations, the United States is very supportive of the Kishida cabinet. They want Prime Minister Kishida to succeed, and they're both because they think he's doing a good job in areas that really matter to the United States, but also because they are worried about the sort of return to revolving door prime ministers in Japan. So we are all still suffering from the political vacuum that was created by the tragic and unfortunate assassination of Prime Minister Abe. And I think the feeling is that no one is really fully capable of filling his shoes. And therefore, the worry is that if Prime Minister Kishida can't succeed, you return to sort of days of turmoil within the LDP. So I think Americans have been reluctant to put pressure on the Prime Minister to make more concessions on these issues, ones that will be unpopular within the LDP, because they worry about undermining his leadership. I think that's a part of this. It's not one that's very visible, but it's there.
Well, the Americans have a beautiful role. It's a cheerleader, but not very noisy. So they are watching the situation carefully. And I think it was one of the reasons why we succeeded in reaching this piece of art. But having said that, I have been asked by many what's going to happen next. And my answer is devil is in the details. And you never know what's going to happen next. And I'm particularly interested in what would happen in Seoul. What do you think? And how can we continue to be successful if we are successful so far? And what are the obstacles? And what are the obstacles in Japan and in Seoul and then maybe in Washington as well?
I've been reading the Korean media, and the reception to this declaration is I'd say at best mixed. There is what you would expect from the sort of progressive end of the Korean agenda. Opposition talk about how this is an act of humiliation, that basically you're solving this problem by Korean companies paying money to compensate the forced laborers who worked in Japanese factories and mines during the war, and not Japanese. So there's that on the left, there is that. I think that's manageable politically for now. The problem is that even in more moderate circles, there's a sense that so far all the steps on this particular issue that have been taken by the Korean side. Now I think that when President Yoon comes to Japan, which may happen very soon, that's another moment where I think it would be important. Personally, I think you could make this agreement really stand up, or this understanding really stand up to pressure within Korea if the two Japanese companies announce that they're going to contribute money to this Korean fund. They say something directly to the Korean workers. That will, I think, lead to them accepting this. And that's very important, because if the Korean workers, the people who are involved in the suit, accept it, it undermines those activists on the left who want to attack this. And I say that based on my conversations also with the law firms that are representing these workers. So I think that would be important, and I think it's important for the Prime Minister to speak for himself about how he understands the wartime past. I know the plan is for him to reaffirm past Japanese statements. The Kim Obuchi statement of 1998, obviously the previous statements of Prime Minister Abe, Prime Minister Murayama. That's fine, and I think that's a good thing to do. But I think people would like to hear what does Prime Minister Kishida think himself. I mean, that's leadership too. Leadership is not just reaffirming past governments, it's giving you a sense of what he as a person thinks, and that there are moral as well as political issues involved here. So I think those steps on his part will really provide a more solid underpinning to the really important progress that's been made in getting Japan and Korea back on a sort of normal state of relations.
Well, it's great to have you, Dan Snyder. He was bureau chief of the Christian Science Monitor in Moscow,
yes,
in Tokyo, and since how many years ago you moved to Stanford? You've been teaching students, and also you were associate director of the East Asian something.
Of the Asia Pacific Research Center.
Excuse me. So he's a real expert on our part of the world. But today he sounded a little bit more neutral by the Korean standard, a little bit more critical about the Japanese position. But I think in the end, this process has been a product of long discussions under the surface of the waters between two foreign ministries, as well as like-minded politicians, serious people. So I think it's a great product, and let's hope that things are going to improve. And I'm sure that President Yoon will be highly warmly welcomed in Tokyo.
Well, I'd like to give tribute to the diplomats who do the hard work to make this kind of thing happen. That we don't see them working very much. We see the politicians, right. But you don't get there. You don't get there without the diplomats.
All right. Well, thank you, Dan Schneider. This is the end of this portion of the CIGS Foreign Policy National Security TV. This program has been focused on various international issues, and I hope that you will get a better appreciation and would register yourself for this channel, and I see you next time. Thank you, Dan, for coming.
Thank you, Kuni.